Welcome to the Irish Revolution. Last month, in March 1919, the Irish Volunteers raided Constance Aerodrome in North Dublin. We spoke about efforts to secure arms in general and the difficulties this caused. We also spoke a little bit about the killing of a resident magistrate in Westport in County Mayo. This month, April 1919, will see the second sitting of Dáil Éireann, where Eamon de Valera will be formally elected Príomh-Éire, or President, though perhaps it would be better translated as Prime Minister. A government is then appointed. Near the end of the episode, I'll talk about the Limerick Soviet, which took place between the 15th and the 27th of April. I will not go into the detail about the Paris Peace Conference, as I do hope to make a special episode about this in the upcoming months. Let's just leave it at the fact that the Sinn Féin party and Irish Republicans in general were gradually coming to the realisation that they would not be getting recognition from the Paris Peace Conference. Just to remind you, every month I'm going to do a minimum of 1 and a maximum of 3 biographies of prominent players in the revolutionary period. In February we had Eamon de Valera, Michael Collins and Harry Boland. In March, Richard Mulcahy. This month we're going to look at Constance MARKIEVICZ, Arthur Griffith and Cathal Brugha. Constance MARKIEVICZ was a socialist and revolutionary activist, the first woman elected to the British Parliament. She did not take her seat due to the Sinn Féin policy of abstention. She took part in the 1916 Easter Rising along with the Irish Citizen Army, a working class militia or army. She was originally sentenced to death but was pardoned on account of her sex. She was certainly among the most famous of her generation, with the French press in particular somewhat fascinated by her. What about her peculiarly non-Irish name? She married into Polish nobility. She herself was of upper class, so-called Anglo-Irish stock. Arthur Griffith was an acerbic, advanced nationalist journalist and founder of the Sinn Féin party. Not a doctrinaire Republican by any means, he originally proposed a dual monarchy position similar to the arrangement Hungary had with Austria at the time. So in other words, Ireland and Britain would share the monarchy, but Ireland would be de facto independent. He was not involved in any way with the 1916 Easter Rising, but the British and the media immediately characterised it as a Sinn Féin rebellion. So in the aftermath, the Republicans essentially took over his tiny political party and transformed it into the juggernaut that it would later become in the 1918 general election. Cathal Brugha was, in contrast to Griffith, a rather doctrinaire Republican. He fought in the 1916 Rising at the South Dublin Union under Eamon Ceannt. He was briefly the Príomh-Éire, or President of the Dáil, until de Valera formally assumed the position in April 1919. He was the Minister for Defence in the revolutionary government, although he did not play as active a part as maybe might be supposed from his title, as Michael Collins and Richard Mulcahy did much of the day-to-day operational management of general headquarters of the IRA. I could probably do more, but 3 is kind of a maximum, otherwise the entire episode would be mini bios like that. Alright now, so look, let's have a look at Dáil Éireann. As I said, this month would see the second sitting of Dáil Éireann on April 1st. De Valera became Príomh-Éire, which you can translate to Prime Minister, although I'm going to continue referring to him as the President, even though it's not strictly speaking true. The rudiments of a cabinet government began to spring up. Some of the following secretaries, later called ministers, were more active than others. Some of the departments were mere fiction propaganda devices, but as we'll see in future episodes, some of the departments turned out to be very real and would form the core of the emerging counter-state. Here is a list of some of the ministers. Constance MARKIEVICZ took over Labour. As a self-described socialist, it would have suited her. Arthur Griffith, no socialist, would get Home Affairs. Cathal Brugha, previously holding on to the title of Príomh-Éire, took over Defence. Count Plunkett, father of the martyred Joseph Plunkett, took Foreign Affairs. Future leader of the Free State, W.T. Cosgrave, had Local Affairs. Ernest Blythe took over Trade and Commerce, by the way, one of the only Ulster Protestants involved in the Irish Revolution. Owen MacNeill, celebrated scholar and former Chief of Staff to the Irish Volunteers, took Industry, and Michael Collins was appointed Secretary for Finance. Although he had unofficially already assumed the role, Collins had prior financial experience as a younger man when he lived in London. A few days after announcing Collins as Finance Secretary, De Valera announced that the Dáil would issue so-called Republican bonds, which had the aim of raising $250,000 in Ireland, and the same again in America. De Valera would go to America in June and take charge of that end of it. Collins would lead the charge in Ireland. I'll talk about the Dáil loan, a fantastic success by the way, which helped lend credibility to the entire counter-state effort at a later date. The Dáil would meet for a third time on April 10th. De Valera would formally call for the boycott of the RIC, Royal Irish Constabulary, the police, calling them England's Janissaries. The boycott had in reality started years before in certain cases, and of course there had been clashes between the police and RIC, but as this boycott went on, the effect on the RIC would become catastrophic. The RIC, in case you're not already aware, were a kind of gendarmerie, not a typical police force in the sense that they were armed with rifles and had a political, not just a civil function. RIC monthly police reports often informed on the political activities in the respective areas. They are to be contrasted with the unarmed Dublin Metropolitan Police Force, although their G Spy division were considered to be a legitimate target of the IRA. They were accused by some Dáil participants of being guilty of treason, and CONSTANCE MARKIEVICZ would end up in prison yet again for publicly calling for the boycott of the police. The Dáil was not actually calling for armed conflict against the police, even if some of the rhetoric from some of the Dáil members was effectively calling for that. At the ground level, in many areas, the IRA effectively saw this as giving them license to engage in combat with the RIC, and there had not been that many attacks between Solheadbeg in January and now. For example, Frank Thornton soon after addressed the assembled battalions of the Longford Brigade and said the RIC had, quote, taken arms against the IRA by orders of England. Meet this force with a vengeance. We were to give no quarter whatsoever until we wiped them out, unquote. How much of the renewal of conflict could be down to the failure of the Paris Peace Conference to recognise Irish independence? It's hard to say really, but its failure to accomplish anything perhaps reinforced the military wing of Irish republicanism and helped persuade some who had until that point been happy to continue exploring the diplomatic and political routes to the Irish Republic. Okay, moving on now. What was the Limerick Soviet and why have I never heard about this? Up and down the country, trade unions organised local strikes and formed workers' council. I made an episode talking about social movements in Ireland at this time. The Russian word Soviet, from which the country the Soviet Union was named, loosely translates to council in English, so the concept of a Soviet meant a local council, in this case of workers. So the Limerick Soviet referred to the temporary rule of the city by a workers' council. It would not have been, at the time, necessarily associated with the Soviet Union as a political entity, but instead with the concept of workers controlling a local area, a workers' council. The Soviet was in effect the result of a general strike which began after Limerick City was declared a special military area by the British after the funeral of an IRA man and trade unionist called Robert Byrne, who had died from his wounds received during his rescue from incarceration. The restriction of free movement was resented by the local population, and the Limerick Trades Council declared a general strike on 14th April. A strike committee was formed, a Soviet, and this effectively ruled the city for 10 days. They benefited from the coincidence that a lot of international journalists happened to be in Limerick at the time covering a transatlantic flight. The refusal of the Labour Party and Trade Unions Congress to support it financially or to call a national strike in solidarity ultimately doomed the Soviet. Negotiations involving the strike committee, the British military, the Lord Mayor and the Catholic bishop brought the strike to an end on 24th of April. What, for me, is most interesting about the strike, or the Soviet, is that it indicated a popular revulsion to British policy in Ireland. This indicated above all else that the movement against British rule was not just the domain of very doctrinaire Republicans involved with the IRA. It was truly a grassroots movement now, as had been indicated by the success of the 1918 general election. There would be many more strikes and Soviets over the next few years, and the Labour movement would continue to project its power at the national stage, in alliance with the Republican movement under Sinn Féin and the IRA. And finally, just to give a taste of what would come in the future in County Cork, there was an ambush in Aileries this month. A police patrol were attacked just outside the village by men armed with shotguns. Nobody was killed, but 3 were wounded. British military visited the scene the following day. In these early encounters of the war, the targets were the RIC, the Royal Irish Constabulary, the police. This even predated the Dáil declaration of ostracisation of the police. These scattered attacks on isolated police in rural areas would ratchet up in the near future, and combined with a public campaign against the RIC, police morale would collapse and resignations would increase dramatically. These numbers would in the future be reinforced by recruited former servicemen in Britain, the hated Black and Tans, and then even later the Auxiliaries. But we're still a bit away from the arrival of the Black and Tans in Ireland and the escalation of the conflict into a war. Alright, thanks so much for watching. See you again soon. Good luck now. Good luck.